Hi, Joe Cerrone. Here's our lecture for Chapter 3. Today we're going to look at drawing with AutoCAD these conference rooms. And this book was done by Beverly and James Kirkpatrick. Sorry about that. Let's take a look at how to use some of these commands like break, chamfer, copy, distance, divide, drawing templates, explode. What I'll do is a 10-minute brief on how to use these commands. And so let me turn on my timer and we'll get started with that. So drawing templates have a DWT extension on them. And essentially what they do is they allow you to open a drawing and then name it something else. And so we have drawing templates located in our D2L. You download the template and you can open that, and then it allows you to save it as a drawing file or a DWG file, just like in Microsoft Word. Polylines, when we work with polylines, they're basically joined. And so polylines are joined, and it also gives you the ability to do some things three-dimensionally, which requires closed boundary shapes. The offset command, we use a ton of it. And so as we use the offset command, there are different offset values. And so one of them is a distance and the other is through. And so when we work with the offset command, I'm just going to toggle back and show you the right way to use it. In model space, if I have a line like this and I hit escape and I want to offset that, you can go to the offset command. And a good way to learn how to use the commands is to just hover over them and wait for the help screen. Enable the help command by hitting the F1 key. It's supposed to go right to the offset command, but it seems to glitch quite a bit. It didn't. And so type in offset. YouTube, Google, best. And so it'll go through and tell you how the offset command works. And the way you read through these screens is that there are options. You have offset distance, and then you have other things like offset through. So when you work with offset, you'll just work with those two for the most part, distance and through. Distance, you just program it in. Through, when you say offset, you select an object and then you tell it T for through, and then you give it the point you want to offset it through. And it'll just hit it right to that mark, so you don't have to know the measurement. So when we go with offset, I can say 2 inches, enter. It remembers the last value, and then it'll stay modal and allow me to just keep offsetting things. And it'll offset circles, arcs, lines. And then if I have something else like out here, and I don't know where the geometry is, and I want it to be offset through right through that end point, you can say offset down arrow through. Select the object to offset, this one. Select the through point. Use an object snap like this, endpoint, and it'll go and create a parallel line through that. Back to our PowerPoint. So that's the offset command. The explode command will break things, and you have to be careful when you use it because it breaks multiple entities into single entities. And it'll mess up your 3D work if you explode solids. If you work with polylines, it'll break them into individual entities. And so you will use the explode command. You'll use those on blocks and things like that. If I were to explode my geometry, when you hover, you'll see it's all one piece. If I went up here and I exploded that, now it's going to be individual lines and individual arcs. And we'll go into applications for that as we go. ID point is really good for figuring out an XY coordinate. It's really more of a mechanical app when you get down to it. If I want to know the exact center of this room, I can go to ID point, and it's under here under utilities, ID point, and I could ID the center point right here, and it'll give me the X and Y location relative to the 0 point. And so it's better on mechanical because you'll use it to run machines, and you'll need to drill a hole, and you'll need to know the exact location for that. Trim, we use a ton. And the way trim works is that it cuts something to a boundary entity. So to trim, you must first select cutting edges. At least in the 2019 version you did. In the 2021, everything's a cutting edge, which is the way it should be. And so you'll use trim a lot. And as we go through and we learn the trim command, you have to have a line that cuts through something else like that. And then when I work with trim, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say trim, and then I'm going to hit enter to make everything a cutting edge. And then you can just hover and it will cut through whatever you want to trim. The old school way of trim was to say trim, select the cutting edge, hit enter, and then you would trim it back to that line. But only lines that touch that would be trimmable. This one and this one, since they don't intersect, will not trim. This one will, because this is my boundary or my cutting edge. The easiest way is to just select trim, enter, and make everything a cutting line. Back to our lecture. Rectangle is a polyline, meaning it's an enclosed boundary. There's different ways to draw rectangles with corner values. That's pretty fundamental. Chamfer will allow us to put these edges or chamfers, typically 45. Chamfer and fillet are about the same. And so if I wanted to chamfer the edges of like a chair or something like that, what I would do is I'd come back here to my drawing. And then if I decided that the edges of my chair were going to be chamfered 2 inches, I would say chamfer, down arrow, distance 2, enter 2. So it goes x-axis, y-axis, and then you select the lines you want to chamfer. 1, 2. Repeat. L likes to use the multiple command, which will keep it in that mode. And so I can put that chamfer on there. It does a lot of other things like polylines. And so like with fillet, if I go and I enable fillet and I change the radius of it. And so we'll say fillet radius, let's say 4 inches. One of the options is polyline. And so since the table is a polyline, I can put a 4-inch fillet on all the edges with one step. It's good for breaking sharp edges of things, so you don't have to go through and do everything. And so you can use fillet and chamfer on polylines and things like that. And then, you know, like I was talking about before, I like to use polylines because I like to do 3D. And since the table is already a polyline, if I wanted to 3-dimensionalize it, I could go and use the 3D move to move it up along the x-axis. And let's just say we'll move it 3 feet up. And then as we start to work with it, I can do things like extruding it. Let's do that in a very visual mode so I can see it. E-X-T-R-U-D-E, extrude. And I could take that table, extrude it. And then I could say, well, let's just go 2 inches, make it a big, thick table. And so we can kind of work with polylines in that manner. And as I start to work with them, I'll toggle back and forth between 2D and 3D and do things like creating in the center of it, if I can get my O-snaps to grab. So I don't have a center because it's a polygon. But I would put a pedestal in here into a table. Other things too, I could, you know, as I work with extrude or press pull, since the walls our boundary shapes, and I know I exploded one, but it'll still work because it'll create it. You can go through and you can create, let's just go 4 feet high. You can go and start to model these things a little bit. And you're welcome to go into that. Al loves this stuff, so once you get him started on that, he will go and model everything. But if you go back to a top view, again, it just starts to look like regular two-dimensional drawings. Copy and O-snap. When we O-snap, we're more precise. And so we use copy, modify, any of those commands. You're going to want to use O-snaps, or you're going to want to snap to a grid to keep the geometry where it's supposed to be. And so when we go and we copy and modify, all of the commands work the same. So if I wanted to copy this chair over to another element, so if I have a rectangle out here and I want to copy the chair to the midpoint of it, I would say copy. I would select the chair. Notice blue or green. Blue selects everything inside of the box, nothing that doesn't go all the way in the box. And so you start getting selective with your selection sets. Enter, and then choose a midpoint. And then I could go over here and I could say, well, I want it to the midpoint here. There, I'm getting it. If not, shift right mouse click, midpoint. And I can grab that there and I can hit escape. So these modify commands like object snaps. I can move it. Again, if I use a blue window, it only gets the lines that I want. And I can move it from here, and then I can just track that up. I could type 4. And so now I'm starting to get a little more fluid with my CAD commands. Rotate works kind of the same way as move does. If I come back here to my desk and I want to rotate it 45 degrees, I can say rotate. Where is it? There we go. And I can select it, hit enter, and then it wants a base point. They all do. Where do I want to rotate it about? And so I'll say from this corner of the desk, and I'll say 45. It rotates counterclockwise. So if I undo that and I rotate it again, I would say negative 45 rather than so that it will turn clockwise. You can always do it by eye with the mouse, and I like to do that. Points. There is a point setup, a point style. And so if I draw with points, you need to program in the point settings. And so when we come back here, here's how to draw a point. You draw a point by going to the point command right here, multiple points. And when you draw them, they're just dots. You can't even see them on the screen. And so I'm drawing these points, but they're just a pixel wide. To make them visible, you go to point style, and then you set a point style. I like to use absolute units, and I typically make them like 1/4 of an inch. Those are too small. Let's go back and make these, let's just make it 1 foot. And so you can see as you increase the point style sizes, you can then see them. And so point styles, let's say 3 feet. They get bigger. And then you can also go through and change the way they look, squares. And I'll use point styles to locate things. Like if I'm putting in a fence and I go down to Home Depot, fence is sold in 8-foot sections. And so you can use commands like divide and measure to place points along a line. So if I have a line here that's going to be like a fence, and so we'll make it 40 feet long. And then if I wanted to put fence units on it, what I would do is I would say measure. And so they have divide and they have measure. And if I say measure, select the object to measure this line. And then the length, I'm going to say 8 feet. Every 8 foot, it'll put a point there. And then I can say how many sections of fence I need. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And it works really good on arcs too, because those are more difficult to measure. All right, continuing on, let's drive through this. That's the divide command, works the same as the measure command. If I divide this into 4 equal units, it does the math for you. And here's measure like I did with the fence. Here's our O-snaps. You can go and toggle through the different settings, or you can shift right mouse click. And so when I'm in a drawing, you will toggle these on and off right here with the check mark, and then you can go into the settings, which goes into the drafting settings, and they're called running O-snaps because they're like magnets. When they're on and they're close to an endpoint, it'll magnetize and it'll give you a glyph of a square. When I'm near a midpoint, it'll magnetize it and give me a glyph of a triangle. And then here's the O-snaps I just showed you through the drafting settings. Mirror is pretty straightforward. You can mirror a line. When you mirror it, it'll ask you if you want to keep the geometry. And so when we get into this, if I mirror something, I'll select it and then I'll hit enter. And I'm just going to eyeball a mirror line like right here. And so I can mirror that. And when it says erase source object, if I say yes, it'll flip it. If I say no, it'll give me a copy of it. So if I mirror this again, I'm just going to make up the line. No, it keeps the geometry. Aperture size, these are in the drafting settings, and this is where when we are in a drawing, if you right click and you go to options, we'll use this kind of stuff quite a bit. And so here's our selection box, 3D modeling, drafting. That's the aperture box. And if you want to make somebody upset, you can make it like really huge, really small. You can match the color of the aperture box to the background and they won't be able to find it. There's all kinds of tricks I learned teaching high school on how to make it not work. But essentially, it's the size of the pick box. Break command, I really don't use it. What I use is I just offset and use lines and trim rather than break. It's not really needed. Here's Polyline edit. You can p-edit and join. We'll talk about this when we start going into 3D. Essentially, what p-edit does is it makes 2 lines into one shape, or 3 lines into one shape. P-edit, join. Hatching allows you to fill up boundary shapes. And in the exercise, it asks us to go through and hatch the conference room. And so if we go to our conference room, since I modeled it, it's already showing as a solid, but I think I have a second one here. If I go to mine here, there's my other one. So hatch works like this. I want you to use a different layer when you hatch things. So I'm just going to go and pull that layer up. And then when you select hatch, you get the ability to choose what pattern you want. And so, for example, if I wanted to hatch this with a brick pattern, let's say we have a brick table. Well, let's go with this. Let's say it's tile. You can go and you can hover in that area and click. Now you'll look at it and you go, wow, it doesn't look hatched. It looks like fully solid. You have to adjust these scales. All of them are different. And so when it comes in like that, I'll bump it up. I'm going to say 100. 100's a little better. If I say 50, there we go. And so that's my hatch pattern. You can also adjust the angle of these hatch patterns. And then you can lay them down like that. And so you can use hatch patterns to hatch the walls, is what they did in the exercise. And so if I wanted to put a hatch pattern in and just like a gray solid, the way that I would do that would be I would go and change this color here to gray. And then I would go to the hatch command, and then I would put it in the boundary. And sometimes this can be a little tricky. It doesn't always like it. That one worked. And I will go through and I will select the pattern I want solid, and then green check mark it. If I want to make the chairs like that, I can just go back here to hatch. It remembers the last one, and I could hatch those. Hatching works really good when you start getting into stuff like I'll do kitchen designs, and I'll hatch things with different gradients. And so it does allow you to use hatching gradients. If I come back here, and I'll show you that technique when we go into doing like kitchen cabinets. And so you can go and you can hatch them with these different gradient patterns, and they kind of look like wood. I'm not going to do that. I don't really want to. The array command allows you to make multiple copies of the chairs or the desks. You can array in 2D, 3D, and then the distance command allows us to measure things. And so when we get into the different commands, I'm going to start to speed up a little bit so the video doesn't get too long. When we use the array command, if I come over here and I want to create an array, what I would do would be to, let's say I have a little speaker like that, and I want 4 of them. What I would do is I would say array, polar is round, and so I'll say array that circle, enter. Give me the center of it right here, and then the number of items. And so if I want 4, only the people at the corners get the speakers, and then I'll green check mark that. And then a rectangular array is more of a traditional classroom. And so if I rotated this back to normal, and I did a polar array, excuse me, a rectangular array, when you select the items, you can go through and select and very quickly make an array. And you can also go and click on how far apart you want them. So if I want these to be 8 feet apart, then I can upgrade that with our social distancing policies. We'll get an extra 2 feet. You can also grab this one and you can make more of them. So as you track them, and so it quickly allows you to do these different multiple options of copying. The distance command or grips we'll use to edit and stretch different objects. There's a lot to grips. When you get into grips, when you grip something like this circle, and I put a grip on, I make it hot. If I hit the space bar, it'll allow me to change it from move to rotate to scale. So grips are toggleable with the space bar. And so you can experiment with that. Continuing on, that's our array command. Polar tracking we want enabled, because what we can do is we can set a vector or a distance, and then when we use that, we can type in the command. It works like a measuring tool. Tracking allows us to, like I was showing you before, kind of hover and acquire a glyph. And I'll show you how that works. This is new. I'm going to avoid this syncing, but apparently you can have a 360 cloud account and save everything to the internet, which seems to be a good idea these days. Okay, that's the lecture. for chapter 3. I'm going to stop the video and open things up for questions.